What I'd like to talk about, Todd and Gary kind of were a little more of a macro approach. Todd was talking about, of course, outlook for corn and soybean prices. Gary was talking about farm income projections, 2018 and 2019. We're going to kind of more fine-tune this a little bit and do a presentation on some work we've done with some field-level data from what's called the Precision Conservation Management Program. So this is probably a little more farm operator, landlord, tuned in type of things. This presentation does start, I believe, on page 27, so you may want to follow along there on the slides. It'll be a little easier to kind of follow along maybe than looking up here. Again, the title of this was Management and Conservation in Face of Lower Returns. I think Todd and Gary both laid out that we have been in a time of lower returns even though we've had exceptional yields, a little lower prices obviously, and potentially now some increase in costs in certain areas leading to that. If those of you that were here last year might remember, we did a presentation on habits of highly resilient farmers, where we did some work through the Illinois Soybean Association looking at farm record information and looking at some farms that traditionally had higher returns over time, and then trying to identify some aspects of those farms for the reasons for those higher returns. What we're going to talk about today would be maybe fine-tuning that a little bit. Again, as we do look at the farm records, and these studies have been done many times over the last 40 or 50 years, we do see a tendency for some farms to have higher returns over time, consistently. In times when we have higher gross incomes like we had in that higher return period, a lot of the reason for the higher returns are due to higher grosses. In times like we're at right now in terms of lower returns, generally it's the cost control side of it that differentiates farms from with higher returns and those with maybe more average returns. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, of maybe a couple areas as we look at cost control that hopefully might, for the operators out there, give them something to think about and maybe experiment with in their own operation. So again, as we talk about lower costs, we do see in some of these operations that have higher returns over time. They don't over-apply inputs. Obviously, from a conservation standpoint, especially from a nutrient management fertilizer standpoint, if we're not over-applying certain nutrients, that's a good thing for the soils and so forth. Even though we do see that some farms do have lower inputs, generally they don't suffer from lower yields, so they still have good yields or up there with the high yields from that standpoint. And obviously, if we can produce the same amount of yields and drop our inputs a little bit, we're going to increase the bottom line from that standpoint. So that's kind of what we're looking at a little bit here. So some of the things we're going to talk about today from a topic standpoint, Todd mentioned PCM. PCM stands for Precision Conservation Management. And I'll talk about that a little more. That's a program that came out of the Illinois Corn Growers Association a few years ago in response to some of the efforts of trying to implement some type of nutrient management plan across the Midwest, across Illinois, to try to help reduce maybe some of the area of fertilizer application, nitrogen applications that we have in some runoffs and some things like that. So trying to fine-tune a little bit. What Gary Schnitkey and I have done with some of the field level data that's gathered from PCM is look at 2 or 3 areas from those field level information. One of the areas is tillage, basically just looking at the different types of tillage that's being done out there, from the amount of tillage, timing of tillage, and so forth, and seeing if there's any yield response or yield differentiations out there with different tillage that's being done. Another area that we looked at is nitrogen, that both in the way of methods of nitrogen application and also the amount of nitrogen being applied. Again, trying to see if there's any differences in yields due to the different types of nitrogen, different timing of nitrogen applications and the amount of nitrogen. And finally, a little bit on cover crops. We did this, the PCM program does collect information on cover crops. It's a little harder to do some economic analysis on cover crops due to the fact that it's probably a more longer term benefit to the soils and so forth, and it's harder to determine what a yearly income might be or return to cover crops might be from that standpoint. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about today. A little bit about PCM. PCM, Precision Conservation Management. And I imagine there might be a few producers in the audience today that have been involved in PCM. PCM began in about 2016. Again, this is a program out of the Illinois Corn Growers Association in response to trying to implement some type of nutrient management program across the state. Originally started in actually the East Central Illinois area, right where we're at right here, and also up in the Woodford, Tazewell, McLean County areas. Since then, it's expanded to 2 other areas, Piatt, DeWitt, Christian County, and down kind of southeast from there. So that's just starting in those areas. So we really don't have much information from those other counties yet. But currently there are 16 counties enrolled or participating in PCM in the central part of the state. From those other 2 areas that originally started, we had now about 200 farmers enrolled in the program. And over the 3 years of data that we had about 200,000 acres so far and about 1,800 fields. Program started in 2016, actually went back and started collecting data for the 2015 crop year. So we have data from 2015, 16, and 17 now that we've done some work, some analyzing some of the numbers and so forth. Obviously, we'll have 2018 here pretty soon, but don't have that at this point in time. Corn Growers Association does plan on keeping this program going and expanding in other areas of the state. So hopefully we'll get up in the northern and southern areas of the state in the next few years. Again, it's a program of the Illinois Corn Growers Association, also supported by the Illinois Corn Marketing Board in helping this. Again, response to nutrient management concerns. What Gary and I have done is just as part of, we're just one little piece of this, but trying to look at trying to do some of the economic management analysis of some of the data, the field level data that we do receive from this program. Some of the support structure for PCM. PCM does actually have 4 specialists hired, precision conservation management specialists hired that work with the farmers in that area. They also have what they call data collection representatives. These are people that assist with the entry of the field level data with the farmer into a software program, web-based program in terms of entering the detail. And there is some very detailed information collected in terms of this field level data. So there is assistance provided in getting the information that's needed and also entering that data into the program. Again, I talked about some of these things. PCM does provide enrollment and data collection assistance. There are opportunities for financial and technical assistance. The PCM specialists are well-trained and well-versed in what's available out there in terms of NRCS type of programs. And they try to point out these programs to farmers if they're not participating to maybe help them get some funding from the government, such as CSPS and things like that. Those type of programs that they may not be aware of, and provide some assistance in the conservation management areas. One of the things that operators do receive is called a RAP program. That stands for Resource Analysis and Assessment Plan. It's basically a summary of the information for the year that they've provided that provides kind of an environmental feedback of their farming operation, and economic feedback also is involved in that. So there's a number of different things that they get back based on the information that's entered in the program. The PCM specialist kind of then goes over that plan with the farmer, try to help them see how they can maybe improve the bottom line, improve some of the conservation work that they're doing in the farming operation and so forth. Gary and I have tried to put together some benchmark information based on some of those type of standards, that being tillage, nitrogen use, and so forth, nitrogen methods of application, try to get some averages or benchmarks, as we call them, where maybe they can kind of then compare their operation to the standards or averages of groups in the same standards. One of the reports, one of the type of information that is, again, provided to the farm operator is this economic analysis report. And basically, the format on the left-hand side there, as you can see, and it's in your handout, is similar to the kind of the budget format that Gary puts together when he does crop budgets. Basically, looking at returns and costs, getting down to a bottom of line. As far as a measure of profitability would be a return to the operator and land. As far as how do we produce these numbers, it's important to know that Dollars and cents or financial information is not collected in this. So we don't try to collect field level cost data and so forth. But we do is kind of engineer that information based on, we do collect the amount of inputs that are applied, the type of tillage or type of field operations that are done over the farm. And then we use kind of either custom rate information or input information, input cost information to generate these cost figures. So it was intentionally done that dollars and cents information from the farmer himself is not input. It's more the amount of inputs applied, the number of field operations done, and so forth. So in terms of how we produce this report from the revenue standpoint, yield information is collected. So we calculate an average standard price for corn and soybeans and so forth over the year and multiply that times their actual yields to get a gross figure. As far as crop inputs, fertilizer, chemicals, and seed, the level or the amount of NP and K that's applied in terms of pounds per acre that are applied is collected. We use kind of, again, a standard price for the year for those inputs to figure a cost. Seeding rate information is collected, so the amount of plant population and so forth, the amount of seeding, their seeding rate per acre is collected, and then again, taking a standard price for corn and soybean seed to calculate a cost. From a herbicide standpoint, we do ask for the amount of active ingredients that are applied on the field. So again, based on the amount of active ingredients applied in terms of chemical costs and so forth, we figure a cost per acre for that. From the power and equipment standpoint, all the different field operations, planting, tillage, harvesting, and so forth that are done are recorded. So again, based on the number and type of operations done on the field during the year, we calculate a cost per acre for that. So that kind of is where we get the information, or how the cost information is engineered, if you will, for these different for the different fields. Again, summaries are prepared then for tillage, nitrogen application, and amount of nitrogen applied, and then cover crop information. So that's kind of a basis of how the information is collected, what the program is. This then will go to some tables that kind of illustrate some of the results, some of the information that we've looked at so far from the first 3 years of data that we received. This one's called tillage and corn. So what this means is basically these are field level information on fields that are going into corn production. And we're looking at what tillage has been done in these fields prior to planting and so forth in terms of crop production. So again, as I mentioned, we started collecting information for 15, so we have 3 years of information, 15, 16, and 17. You can see, based on the type of tillage, type of planting operations that were done, we've kind of classified these fields into 4 groups in this set of data: no-till, strip-till, 1-pass, and 2-pass. And we talk about 1-pass and 2-pass, that's basically the amount of tillage passes that are done, not every pass that's done on the farm, so that's the amount of tillage. So again, if you think about, in most instances in this area of the state, most of these operations would have, I would assume, a corn and soybean rotation. So these would basically be soybean fields, for the most part, that are going into corn production. So you'd have a 1-pass or a 2-pass system. A 1-pass would simply be, I would assume, no tillage done in the fall on the soybean stubble, and then a 1-pass field cultivate or something like that done in the spring before planting. 2-pass would be probably something done in the fall on the soybean stubble, and then 1-pass in the spring. So you can see the number of fields that fell into each of the different classifications over those 3 years. SPR stands for soil productivity rating. That's just simply a measure of the productive quality of the soil. Obviously, the productive capacity of a soil is going to have some influence on yields, so we try to collect that information. These fields are geo-classified, so we can go to the NRCS soil maps and actually figure out the type of soils in the fields and calculate a soil productivity rating, so we have that type of information in here. So you can see what the 3 years of average yields have been on these different types of tillage methods, and an average on the fourth column over there has an average for the 3 years. So if you look at the average yields for the 4 years or 3 years of information for the four type of tillage methods, you can see actually the strip till and the 1-pass system yielded the highest return. The highest yield was the 2-pass system with 209 bushel per acre. But when you figure in the extra tillage operations being done there and some other factors, those bottom 3 yielded similar type of returns, but actually the strip till and the one pass operations had the most net return. Again, I think it's just something to point out is extra tillage being done yielding any additional profit to the operation. In this case, that wouldn't be the case where we don't see an advantage over a two-pass system over some of the other operations. Looking at the same thing for soybean production, again, these are fields that are going into soybean production. Again, most of these probably would have corn as far as the previous crop on these fields. The classifications that we put together for the different tillage operations here, we have a no-till, a one-pass, two-pass, and 2+ passes. So again, if you think of a field that has corn stalks, probably some operation, chiseling or something like that done in the fall. In the spring, we would have probably an operation where we're leveling out the chisel field and then another pass from another pass in terms of a field cultivator or something like that before the planting operation. So that would be a 2+ system if we had that. So again, you can see the number of fields that fell into each of these different classifications. Actually, no-till, 434 fields, had the most fields that fit into that classification or any of the classifications. Again, you can see the SPR, which is soil productivity rating, what the average soil productivity rating was for these different fields. And then you can see the soybean yields over the 3 years here. Again, 2015, 16, and 17. And you can see the one-pass system had the highest average yield, 68 bushels per acre compared to the other 3 type of systems, and also yielded obviously the highest operator and land return. So again, just kind of trying to get at, is there any advantage of additional tillage operations or is there not? And in this case, again, you can see the one-pass system had the highest net return and the highest yield. So again, especially this year, we probably didn't get all the tillage done that we normally would have due to the weather conditions. It might be a good year to experiment out there if you're an operator to just experiment a little bit on cutting back some tillage if you're doing quite a bit of tillage and see if that has any effect in terms of the bottom line there. Looking at nitrogen, another area that we looked at, as I mentioned, is the amount of nitrogen applied and the type of nitrogen methods applied in terms of timing of application and so forth. Many of you are probably aware of a nitrogen rate calculator that was put out a few years ago from the Midwestern Land Grant Systems. MRTN is maximum return to nitrogen is what that stands for. There's a website there that shows where you can access this calculator. Basically, this calculator was put together to put in a price for corn, price for anhydrous ammonia, and give feedback on what the suggested amount of nitrogen applied should be given the price of corn, the price of anhydrous ammonia. You can see here the different recommendations. And again, this is crop science information. Crop scientists have put this together. But you can see for Central Illinois, they're suggesting at $4 corn and $525 ton nitrogen, an application rate of 183 pounds per acre for Central Illinois. Again, this is also assuming corn following soybeans, so there would be some credit there for the soybean crop in the previous year. The interesting thing to note here is, as compared to what kind of our old recommendation was, where we had the 1.2 pounds of N per estimated production for a bushel of corn, these would be probably quite a bit less in terms of the amount of nitrogen suggestions, suggestions for application than what we've been used to doing. And as we look at most of the farms would be above this current rate. So again, looking at nitrogen application methods, first of all, again, taking the field information that we had, cornfields, kind of breaking it down in a couple different categories. First here that we looked at is basically the nitrogen application method. And what we mean by that, most of them kind of fell on these 4 different application methods. Primarily fall, which would be an anhydrous ammonia application in the fall, which is pretty common yet. You can see the number of fields that fell in that category. Mostly pre-plant, which would be some kind of probably 28 or 32% solution that was applied in the spring prior to planting. Then mostly side dress, which would be application after planting had been done. And then kind of a split application, which we see a little more being done, 50-50 pre-plant, which means we applied some of our nitrogen before planting, and then come back and did some side dress after planting. And we do see some movement to applications, some application of nitrogen after planting to kind of put on the nitrogen when it's going to be best utilized by the corn crop. So you can see the number of fields, again, the soil productivity rating on those fields is far over an average. Then we have a couple panels in there that shows the amount of nitrogen applied by the different years for the different methods, and then also the yields. So as one can expect, I think traditionally would expect with that anhydrous application in the fall, that showed the average that had the highest amount of nitrogen applied, 226 pounds per acre on average over the 3 years. I think when people do apply in the fall anhydrous ammonia, they probably apply a little more, knowing there's going to be some loss potentially over winter, things like that. You can see the other three methods actually were very close in terms of the amount of nitrogen applied, right around 200 pounds per acre. Again, looking at then the next panel that shows the different yields over time. You can see that actually the bottom method, 50-50 pre-plant, had the highest average yield of 217 bushel per acre over the 3 years. Again, there could be other factors that are influencing this, but it does show that that was quite a bit higher than the other three methods. Actually, what's interesting to note is the method with the highest amount of nitrogen applied, which is the fall applied, had the lowest average yields over the 3 years. Again, there could be rainfall factors and other things like that that are influencing this, but it does kind of point out just because you're applying more nitrogen doesn't necessarily mean we're getting a higher yield from those extra pounds of nitrogen applied. And as we look at the operator land return on the right-hand side, as we would expect, the bottom line where we had less nitrogen applied and the highest yield obviously showed the highest operator land return of the different four methods that we had in there. $271 per acre. The lowest return was primarily in the fall of $225 per acre. Again, other factors get involved in that in terms of timing and labor availability and things like that when a producer wants to apply, but those are hopefully kind of shows some results that we may want to kind of think about in our own operation if we're doing something a little different here. This are just some graphs here that Gary put together. The left-hand side is for 2016, the right-hand side is for 2017. Basically, every dot on there is one field. If you look at the line, so the bottom axis is pounds of nitrogen applied per acre. The other axis up and down is yield per acre, and the line that goes up and down is the point where we have 183 pounds of nitrogen per acre, what the suggestion would be from the nitrogen rate calculator. And you can see how many fields were to the right of what our suggestion would be as far as the kind of our suggested level of nitrogen and how many fields are to the right of that. Also, there is a trend line plotted in there that shows a little bit of an upward slope, but from a statistical standpoint, really wouldn't be significant enough where we'd say there really isn't any extra yield gain from the extra amount of nitrogen applied as we move farther to the right, and you can kind of see the number of fields that are farther to the right. We're doing the same thing here in this slide set, again for 2016 and 2017. This is simply for corn fields. The other one was for all the fields. This is for fall applied fields. The other slides are all for all the corn fields. So this is just for corn fields with fall applied nitrogen application. And you can see the majority of the farms here were to the right-hand side at 183 pounds per acre as far as what the suggested rate would be from our nutrient rate calculator. Again, that's probably based on the fact that most producers are probably still applying based on the old 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per suggested bushel of corn yield that we're trying to achieve. So you can see some of them are pretty far out there to the right. So taking that same data and now just breaking it down by the amount of nitrogen applied per acre, you can see the 5 different classifications we have there: less than 150 pounds per acre, 150 to 151 to 175, and so forth. The number of fields, the majority of the fields, as you can see, were over the 176 pounds per acre of nitrogen. Again, the soil productivity rating, and then we have the different yields over the 3 years, for the different levels of nitrogen applied. You can see generally the higher yields were at the higher levels of nitrogen applied, but from an economic standpoint, The highest net return or operator and landlord return was in that range of 151 to 175 with an average yield of 206 bushel per acre for the 3-year average. And again, not that much drop off in the yield or as high yield with less nitrogen applied. Obviously, it will be a little better return than to the operator and land. A little bit of discussion on cover crops. Again, not too much here. We do collect cover crop information in the PCM data. You can see the majority of the farms did not have cover crops in their production practices. A couple things to point out, though, that even though those that did have cover crops didn't experience any yield loss, which we wouldn't expect, actually had a little higher yields and a little higher returns. Some of those higher returns were probably due to the fact that these same fields probably had reduced tillage, so they're saving a little bit on tillage operations, tillage costs. Just some comments or suggestions. There is scientific evidence out there that would show that cover crops do reduce the amount of nitrogen that goes into tiles on tile drained soils, so there is obviously some benefit there. Also, probably some thought that there's some good long-range benefits to cover crops in terms of improvement in the soil health, soil quality, soil organic matter. Again, that's hard to measure over time from year to year, but I think there is some evidence of that. Based on those ideas and some suggestions, if you want to do cover crop, probably the idea of picking your owned fields to do cover crop on, and the reason for that is there's going to be probably more longer range benefits on cover crop use, and if you're doing that, you want to do that on fields that you're going to get the benefit of that over the long run instead of some fields that you may not be farming in 2, 3, 4, 5 years or something like that. Suggesting of using cover crops on the same field over time, again, for the idea of building up the soil health and organic matter would probably be a good idea. Coming up with ways of the operator doing some evaluation on these fields. It is a little harder to kind of figure out a dollar and cents return to that, so maybe you're going to be able to be the best one to kind of feel what benefits are out there and some of the experimenting you can do using cover crops. Probably works best in no-till situations since you're going to have a lot of more refuge on top of the soil, and if you're used to or have a system in place of working with no-till or something like that from a field operation standpoint would be good. You see a little more discussion in newspapers or farm articles about the need for keeping cover crops seeding costs low. You can get quite a few different kind of mixtures out there of cover crop seed. Probably the idea of trying to keep this a little lower than what we started out with in terms of seeding rates and so forth is a good idea. So again, kind of summarizing here from a tillage standpoint, as we looked at the different tillage operations done on some of these fields, we didn't necessarily see extra benefits from additional tillage, so maybe there's some potential for some cost savings there by reducing tillage if you haven't already. From a nitrogen standpoint, probably would be maybe a prudent idea, as we mentioned here, to look at ways of doing some experimenting with nitrogen levels, maybe closer aligned with what the nitrogen rate calculator would show if we're not doing that now, to see if there's any cost savings there without losing yield loss. We do see some interest in splitting nitrogen applications and doing more on spring applied nitrogen, post-planting nitrogen as a way of trying to put on nitrogen what's mainly going to be used by the crop, potentially saving some amounts of nitrogen that we apply. Again, from a cover crop standpoint, just looking at maybe doing that on owned farmland instead of leased farmland and doing some experimenting on your own to see what benefits we might see from that.